The moment I stepped into my childhood home, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't the familiar scent of my mother's lavender-scented candles or the warmth of the fire crackling in the living room. No, it was the silence. A thick, oppressive quiet that hung in the air like a heavy fog, stifling any normal, casual chatter. It felt like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something, or perhaps someone, to mess up. The room was filled with the same faces I'd known for years. My father, Harold, who always seemed too busy to notice anything. My mother, Carol, whose soft eyes had always been a comfort. And of course, my sister Rachel. Rachel, with her perfect hair and flawless smile, was the one who always had everything together, so she made everyone think. This was supposed to be a celebration. My mother's 65th birthday. A simple family gathering to mark another year. The long table was adorned with yellow tulips, my mother's favorite, and the scent of lemon cake, her go-to birthday treat, lingered in the air. But this wasn't a birthday dinner. It was an interrogation in disguise. I hadn't seen most of them in nearly 2 years. 2 years since I cut the ties that had bound me to them, silently and without confrontation. It wasn't that I wanted to create a scene, it was that I had to leave. For as long as I could remember, my family had made me feel small. My father, while kind, had always been emotionally distant. He'd never understood my need for validation or independence. My mother, though sweet, would often let things slide, too passive to stand up for me. But Rachel? She was the one who made me feel like I was always walking on eggshells. If I wasn't living her version of a perfect life, I was nothing. I approached the empty seat at the end of the table, the only one left my heart racing. They all sat back in their chairs, watching me as if they were waiting for me to make a mistake. I could feel their eyes on me, the unspoken judgment hanging in the air. My palms were sweaty, my stomach in knots. After all this time, I still couldn't shake the feeling that I was out of place in my own family. I took my seat and forced a smile at my mother. She was the first to greet me, her arms open wide. Her hug was longer than usual, as if she was trying to make up for all the missed moments. "I'm glad you came," she whispered, her voice trembling. I smiled back, but my heart wasn't in it. I had come for her, not for anyone else. And then, I saw Rachel. She didn't wave or offer any greeting. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest, as if she were already declaring victory in some battle that had yet to be fought. There was that same smug expression on her face, the one that always made me feel inferior, like I could never quite measure up. Dinner dragged on. The conversation felt forced, filled with awkward silences and the clinking of silverware. The stories people told were shallow, and the laughter didn't quite reach their eyes. I could see my uncle leaning in, eagerly waiting for something to happen. He was always the first to fan the flames of drama, and tonight was no exception. Then, just as dessert was being served, Rachel cleared her throat. "Before we dive into Grandma's cake," she said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness, "I have a little something to share." She pulled out a manila folder, tapping it on the table as if it were a weapon. "Since our dear Lena here has been telling everyone about her amazing new life, her business, her big success, I thought we'd take a moment to fact-check." I froze. My stomach churned as I realized exactly what was happening. This was no ordinary birthday dinner. Rachel wasn't here to celebrate. She was here to tear me down. The room went silent. Everyone waited, hanging on her every word. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I hadn't prepared for this. No one had told me that Rachel was about to air my dirty laundry in front of everyone. The truth I had worked so hard to keep hidden was about to be exposed. The tables had turned, and for the first time in years, I wasn't the one holding the cards. The tension in the room thickened, and I braced myself for what would come next. As Rachel's manila folder sat there on the table, the weight of it felt suffocating. My hands clenched around the sides of my chair, but I refused to let her see how rattled I was. I had come here for my mother, not for any of this drama. But Rachel had other plans, as always. She was out for blood, and I knew she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. My heart was pounding in my chest as Rachel slid the folder toward Grandma, her eyes gleaming with triumph. I knew what this was. This was Rachel's way of proving that everything I had worked for, everything I had achieved, was a lie. She couldn't stand the idea of me succeeding. Not without her approval. Not without her being the one to orchestrate it all. She had always been the golden child, the one who everyone praised, while I was always overlooked, underestimated. Now, she was trying to tear me down, piece by piece. "Here, Grandma," Rachel said with a smirk. "Let's take a look at Lena's big success, shall we?" Grandma's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder, and I could feel her confusion in the way her brow furrowed. She was such a gentle soul, and this wasn't the way she had ever wanted to find out about the cracks in our family. Her eyes moved from page to page, her face slowly changing from puzzled to something else. It wasn't confusion, it was something more shock. I didn't flinch. I didn't react. I just stared at Rachel, meeting her gaze with a calm I didn't know I had. I had spent so many years wondering if I'd ever prove myself to my family. But now, in this moment, I realized that I didn't need to. Not anymore. The pages that Grandma turned were filled with documents, charts, and what looked like detailed reports. I could see the nervousness in Rachel's smile. She had thought that these papers would expose my supposed lies, that they would show I was nothing but a fraud. But Rachel had overlooked one key thing. I had nothing to hide. What she didn't know, what she never realized, was that I had built my success from the ground up with grit and honesty. There were no shortcuts, no deception, just a lot of sleepless nights and hard work. As Grandma flipped the pages, I saw Rachel's smirk begin to falter. My business license was on the first page clear, verified, and legitimate. The second page showed my e-commerce dashboard, full of real growth, real customers, and real success. No exaggerations, no inflated numbers. Just proof of what I had accomplished, despite every roadblock my family had thrown in my way. I didn't say a word. I just let the evidence speak for itself. The silence around the table was deafening. The atmosphere had shifted completely. My father, Harold, who had always been so neutral, was looking at the folder with wide eyes. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his gaze. He had always been the one who turned a blind eye to the family drama, but now, as the truth was being laid bare in front of him, he couldn't ignore it, and neither could anyone else. Rachel's confidence began to crack. Her eyes darted between the papers and the family members around the table, waiting for someone to speak, to validate her. But no one did. No one responded. My uncle, who had always enjoyed stirring up trouble, seemed less eager now. He shifted in his seat uncomfortably, and I could see that the drama he had been hoping for wasn't playing out the way he'd imagined. Rachel's gaze moved back to me, but I didn't flinch. I simply held her stare, my expression steady. It wasn't the confrontation I had expected. It was better. This wasn't a battle I had to fight. This was her downfall, not mine. Grandma continued to flip through the pages, and I could see the realization dawning on her. She looked up at me, her face softening with understanding. I didn't need to say anything. She knew. She had always known the kind of person I was, sensitive, earnest, and driven by a desire to prove myself. Not to them, but to me. Finally, Grandma turned to Rachel, her voice soft but unwavering. "Lena's business is legitimate," she said quietly, placing the folder in the center of the table. "And this is unnecessary." Rachel's smile finally broke. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw her falter. She wasn't used to losing control, especially not in front of the family. But in that moment, as the truth settled in the room, it was clear. Rachel had underestimated me, and she had underestimated the strength that came from quietly walking away and building something on my own. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, it was liberating. The truth had a power of its own, and Rachel no longer held the reins. The silence in the room lingered, heavy and thick. It wasn't the kind of silence you could easily ignore. It felt like the air had grown denser with every passing second. I could feel it pressing in on me, the eyes of my family now trained on me. Some were trying to make sense of what had just happened. Others were simply too shocked to speak. But one thing was clear. The tables had turned, and I was no longer the one on trial. Rachel had always been the one in control. Her polished smile, her calculated comments, her ability to twist every situation to her advantage had always given her the upper hand in this family. But now, the roles had shifted. The very evidence she thought would expose me as a fraud had, in fact, turned the spotlight on her. Grandma, who had been the one to unknowingly pass the folder to me, had looked at me with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. I could see it in her eye as she had always believed in me, even when no one else did. She had watched me struggle, watched me quietly fight for a life of my own. And now, for the first time, the truth was finally being seen by everyone. It wasn't just about the business. It was about everything, the years of subtle jabs, the whispered insults, the constant undermining. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment I could finally stand tall and let the truth speak for itself. But Rachel didn't see it that way. As her smile cracked, she scrambled for a way to salvage her position, her carefully constructed narrative starting to crumble before her eyes. This isn't over," she muttered, her voice a little too sharp, too defensive. She wasn't used to losing. She wasn't used to anyone questioning her authority, especially not me. She leaned forward, her eyes flicking between the folder and me. "You think this changes everything?" she said, trying to sound confident. "You think a couple of papers are going to make up for all the lies you've told over the years. You've always been dramatic, Lena. You've always played the victim." My heart sank at her words. The pattern was familiar. Rachel had always been the one to twist everything, to make me feel like I was the one in the wrong. It had been that way for years. Every time I tried to stand up for myself, every time I expressed my feelings or needs, she made sure to undermine me, to remind me that I was too emotional, too sensitive. In her eyes, I was never enough. I was always too much, and yet never enough. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't going to let her rewrite the story. "I'm not playing the victim anymore," I said, my voice steady. "I haven't been the victim for a long time, Rachel. You just never wanted to see me for who I really am." The room was still. Even my father, who had sat silently through much of this, shifted in his seat, his gaze locked on the two of us. Harold, my father, had always been a passive figure in our family. He was the one who never wanted to rock the boat, the one who would sweep things under the rug just to keep the peace. But now, I saw him for the first time truly acknowledging what had been happening. He had been complicit in this silent manipulation, and though he never directly contributed to it, he allowed it to fester. Rachel's eyes narrowed, her expression faltering for a moment. She was used to being the center of attention, to being the one who controlled the narrative. But I had stepped out of the shadows. No longer the quiet, sensitive younger sibling. I was standing in my own truth. Grandma, who had been holding the folder, suddenly spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "Rachel," she began, "Lena has worked hard for everything she has. She's not the problem here." Rachel's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her defenses were crumbling, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, a vulnerability she'd spent years hiding behind her perfect facade. I knew she wouldn't back down easily. Rachel was never one to admit when she was wrong. But in that moment, I realized something. I didn't need her apology. I didn't need her to acknowledge the damage she had caused. I was finally free from the need for her approval, free from the toxic cycle that had kept me trapped in that family dynamic for so long. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was the kind of silence that comes when everyone has heard the truth, and no one knows how to respond. And I didn't need them to. I had already moved on. Rachel didn't speak again. She sat back in her chair, eyes downcast, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment, but the truth had already been spoken, and nothing could take that away. As the evening wore on, the energy in the room shifted, but it wasn't the kind of change I had anticipated. I had expected a confrontation, Perhaps some final words from Rachel or even my father, but instead, the family seemed to fall into a quiet, stunned acceptance. Grandma's calm declaration of my legitimacy had sent shockwaves through the table, but there were no words after that. Rachel, the one who had always commanded attention with her sharp tongue and polished persona, now sat in silence. She no longer had the power to control the narrative. The truth, in all its quiet power, had been spoken, and it was her silence that spoke volumes. I didn't feel the need to fill the space with words. For years, I had been trained to explain myself, to justify my decisions, to beg for validation from the very people who should have supported me. But tonight was different. The silence felt empowering, almost liberating. I had spent so long fighting to be seen, to prove I was worthy of respect, that I hadn't realized how much of my energy had been drained by the constant need for approval. Rachel's gaze never left me, but I didn't look at her. Instead, I focused on the quiet hum of the room, the clinking of glasses, and the soft conversations of the family members who had finally stopped pretending. They were all now fully aware of the weight of the truth, and there was no need for me to defend it. I didn't need to explain how hard I had worked to get where I was, or how much it had cost me to rebuild my life. The silence held all of that and more. In the past, I had sought out moments like this. I had imagined standing tall, delivering the perfect line, and watching my family members come to the realization of what they had done to me. But the truth was, I didn't need a dramatic speech. I didn't need them to acknowledge my pain or my success. The truth, once it was laid bare, was enough. I was enough. As I looked around the table, I saw their faces, the shock, the discomfort, the realization. But there was no pity in their eyes, no attempts to offer me their typical platitudes. They didn't need to. What they didn't realize was that my journey had never been about them. It had been about me. For years, I had tried to earn my place at the table, to prove that I was worthy of love and respect. I had convinced myself that if I just worked hard enough, if I achieved enough, I would finally get their approval. But what I had forgotten was that I didn't need to prove anything to them. I had already proven everything to myself. The quiet in the room stretched on, but I wasn't uncomfortable. I didn't feel the need to rush through it or fill the gaps with unnecessary explanations. I had lived in the noise for so long, the harsh words, the backhanded compliments, the judgments, that I had forgotten the power of peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you no longer have anything to hide, no longer have to explain your choices or justify your existence. I had spent years building a life that was mine, not for anyone else, but for me. The struggle, the late nights, the loneliness, all of it had been worth it, because it had brought me here, to this moment of clarity. I no longer needed anyone to validate my worth, because I had learned to do that for myself. And as I sat in the quiet, I realized something. Rachel's attempts to expose me, to tear down what I had built, were never about me at all. They were about her fear of being exposed for her own lies, fear of losing control. She couldn't bear the idea of me succeeding without her permission. But now, in the face of the truth, I saw her for what she really was, a person trapped by her own need for validation. And in that moment, I realized I had already won. The dinner continued without incident, but I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. I wasn't waiting for their approval, their acknowledgement, or even their apology. I had already given myself the freedom to walk away, not physically, but emotionally. The power of silence, the power of being seen for who I truly was enough. I didn't need to fight anymore. And as I quietly stood up to leave, the peace that washed over me wasn't just relief, it was freedom. The evening unfolded in a way I hadn't expected. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no explosive release of anger. There was simply silence, a silence that felt more like a final exhale, as if all the air had been released from the tension-filled room. And in that silence, I felt a deep sense of peace, one that had been absent for years, perhaps even decades. I wasn't angry at Rachel anymore, nor at the rest of my family. I wasn't looking for validation or approval from them. What I realized in that moment was that I didn't need them to define me. I had already defined myself. As I quietly stood up to leave, the room still frozen with the weight of everything that had been exposed, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to explain myself, to apologize, or to make them understand my actions. I had fought for so long to earn a place at their table, to be seen and heard. But that night, I realized that the only table I needed to be at was my own, the one where I was already seated, fully present in my truth, fully accepting of who I had become. I kissed Grandma on the cheek before stepping into the cool evening air, my heels clicking against the sidewalk like a punctuation mark to the end of a long chapter. The crispness of the night felt refreshing, cleansing even, as if I was walking away from something heavy, something that had weighed on me for years. The cold air was a stark contrast to the warmth of the family home I had left behind, but it was a reminder that I had built something real, something that could not be taken away by anyone, least of all Rachel. Walking down the street, I realized that I had finally let go of something I hadn't even fully understood. I was still holding on to the need to prove myself to them. For so long, I had tried to be someone I thought they wanted me to be. I had worked tirelessly, chasing goals and dreams with the hope that one day they would look at me and finally say, "You've made it. You've earned your place." But in that moment, I knew I didn't need their approval to feel proud of myself. I didn't need their validation to acknowledge the hard work and sacrifices I had made. I was enough, just as I was. The days that followed were peaceful. The messages from my family trickled in, each one asking to talk, to clear the air. My mother called twice, then texted again. "Can we talk? I think we need to clear the air. I want to make things right." I stared at the screen for a long minute, my finger hovering over the keyboard. The words I had once longed to hear felt meaningless now. It wasn't that I was angry. It was just that I had moved beyond their need for resolution. I had given myself the closure I had spent years waiting for. I wasn't going to beg for their acknowledgement anymore. So, I typed one simple message: "You never believed in me until someone else told you to." And just like that, I blocked the number. There was a quiet sadness in that moment. But it wasn't the sadness of loss, it was the sadness of letting go of hope. The fragile, half-dead kind of hope that had kept me tethered to a family that never truly understood me. But there was freedom in that sadness. Freedom in knowing that I didn't need them to move forward, to continue building the life I had created for myself. That night, I returned to my small apartment, the one that I had built from scratch, the one that I had turned into a home. I lit a candle, poured myself a glass of red wine, and settled into the quiet. It wasn't the silence of being ignored or overlooked. It was the peaceful quiet of a life lived on my terms. A life that didn't need validation, applause, or anyone's approval to be meaningful. I sat at my desk, the one I had painted in soft sage, the one where I had designed my first product, my second, my third. The laptop on the desk dinged with the arrival of a new order. A handwritten journal, a custom inscription, a gift wrapped with care. I smiled, not because it was a big sale, but because it was another person believing in something I had created. Not because I begged them to, but because I had built something real, something worthy. For so long, I had thought that success had to be earned by impressing others, by meeting their expectations. But now, I knew that true success was about living authentically, regardless of what anyone else thought. Real life didn't need to be proven to anyone. It simply needed to be lived. And as I sipped my wine, the city lights flickering through the window, I felt a quiet sense of pride. Not for the success, not for the orders or the achievements, but for the fact that I had finally stopped seeking permission to take up space. I was here. I had arrived. And this time, I didn't need anyone to notice. The world didn't need to clap. It just needed to leave me whole.